Robert Reich talking about the destruction of trust. And I've frankly never heard anybody talk about trust as part of the commons. But really, how does a government work without trust? How does a nation work without trust? How is it that a country can move forward without trust? It's very difficult. And without trust, what happens is you get the rise of these essentially seditious factions. And they are factions, in the classic definition, as Dan Sisson, wrote about in his book, the American Revolution of 1800, that a faction is a group of people or an interest group whose interests are not aligned with those of the people or the government. And the big fear, and that last part is the key, right? And the big fear that the founders had was that factions could rise up and take over our government. And, that would be a bad and destructive thing. And, generally speaking, not a good thing. And I would submit to you that the Republican Party has essentially become a faction, or at least a large chunk of it, the vast majority of it. You may have, well, you've had Olympia Snow. You've got one Republican left who's not a faction, who's not part of a faction. Well, even arguably, she's part of the faction because she votes with them. She votes for Mitch McConnell at the beginning of every 2 years, the beginning of every legislative session, to make him the leader. And Mitch McConnell is running a faction, an anti-government faction. And this is a faction that wants to sow distrust in the government that our founders put their lives on the line to create, that soldiers, Union soldiers in the 1860s fought and died to preserve and to improve, that civil rights workers and suffragettes fought and died over hundreds of years to improve, that in the modern era, civil rights workers, women's rights folks, gay rights folks, this whole spectrum of people have fought and in many cases been imprisoned, in some cases even died to continue. So we have this government, this thing that we all created collectively. It's ours. It is the ultimate commons. I've talked about this in the past in the context of voting, that the beating heart of a democracy is the vote. Thomas Paine was the first to use that metaphor. And that if that's the beating heart of the democracy, the vote, then it should be the last thing privatized, right? It should never be privatized. And of course, in about a third of our states, the vote has been privatized to machines that don't even produce a paper trail. And it's been largely privatized in all of our states. But this public trust, this lack of public trust, is what's making possible all this perfidy, all these terrible things that are being done to government, and all these other attacks on other parts of the commons. Because people say, it's all corrupt. Screw it. I'm going to watch sports. Robert Reich says the Republican Party as a whole has embraced this philosophy for more than 2 decades. After Newt Gingrich took over as Speaker in '95, compromise was replaced by brinksmanship. I read that earlier. Like Trump, Gingrich did whatever it took to win, regardless of the consequences. In 2010, he fueled the birther movement. This was Gingrich, by saying President Obama exhibited, quote, Kenyan anti-colonial behavior. 2 years later, he called President Obama the food stamp president. This is Newt Gingrich. And the forces, this is from the, well, I'll share this with you a little later on. Back to your calls after this.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So have Republicans over the last 35 years in this campaign to destroy trust in government destroyed that trust, that essential part of the commons, to the point where government can't function?